All right then, Econ friends, welcome back. So in this video, I want to tackle a real technical thing. We'll do it really quickly, but I want to take a quick look at the mechanics behind, in the PC industry, right, in the perfectly competitive structure, the long run supply curve, okay? Now again, we know and we have learned that in the short run, supply curves are upward sloping, okay? That one's pretty straightforward. But in this video, I want to take a look at some of the technical analysis behind the long run market supply curve, okay? I'm not going to assess you on this. It's not something that's really major for our future stuff, but I want you to be aware of it so that if you ever hear about these terms that I'm going to teach you, a constant cost industry or an increasing cost industry, you have some context, okay? So let's jump in with a really quick discussion of long run market supply curves. And let's first start with the definition. A long run market supply curve, it shows how the quantity supplied in an industry varies with the market price. So the long run market supply curve, like any supply curve, shows how quantity supply varies with price. But because this is a long run supply curve, we have to add the idea that it's how the quantity supplied varies with price, but critically, given enough time for firms to adjust the size of their plants and for entry and exit to happen, okay? In our last video, we discussed the short run to long run transition. And we learned that if there's profits, existing firms can expand, new firms can enter, industry output goes up. And when there's some losses, some existing firms will contract and some firms will exit, also adjusting the industry output. What the long run market supply curve looks at is the connection between the market supply and the market price, but critically, given sufficient time for all that adjustment and for all of that entry and exit to happen. Okay. When you're discussing market supply in the long run, the key question that you're looking at, and it's a real technical abstract thing, okay, so just try to get your head around it. The key question that you're asking is, how will the changes in the number of firms in the industry, remember with exit and entry, the number of firms will be different. So how will changes in the number of firms in the industry affect the input, AKA the resource costs of the individual firms? We know that firms have to buy factors of production to convert them into output. So the question that we're asking here is, as the number of firms in the industry changes, how will that affect the input and resource costs that the individual firms have to pay to buy the resources to produce things, okay? So in other words, what we're really saying is, what happens the cost of production as the industry's output is altered? In other words, what happens to the quantity supplied in the industry when the demand increases or decreases in the industry? Okay, so again, we're really looking at, how is the cost of production faced by individual firms affected based on the movement into or out of the industry as the industry dynamics make it larger or smaller? There are fundamentally, my friends, three possibilities. Possibility one, in what we call a constant cost industry, the factor prices and the cost of production will remain constant even as market output is expanded. In other words, the entry of new firms will have no impact on the ATC curve. This is going to occur when the entry of new firms really doesn't have a marked or important influence on resource availability and pricing. The way it's going to pan out is that the long run market supply curve will be horizontal. Okay, I know you're thinking, I thought they were upward sloping. Well, in the short run, they are for sure, but in the case of the long run supply in a constant cost industry, the supply curve is horizontal. You ask, why is this? Well, the reason why is that in a constant cost industry, if there's an increase in market demand for the product, demand goes up at the industry level, prices go up, there's going to be an increase in the price of the product, and therefore there's going to be some short-term profits. But you know that short-term profits will cause the industry supply to increase because of entry and expansion of output. So again, if you have an increase in market demand for the product, you're going to get an increase in the price of the product. It's going to lead to some temporary profits. That's going to lead to the industry increasing supply. Here's the point. In response to those profits, the market price will return and fall back down to its exact previous level. Because the ATC doesn't change regardless of entry or exit, the minimum ATC will stay the same. So the profit maximizing price and the long-term equilibrium price will stay the same. It will adjust back to its exact previous level. Okay, so that's a constant cost industry. They're somewhat common, but not really. You know, they exist sometimes, but not a lot. What really is the common thing in most industries is our second type. This is known as an increasing cost industry. In an increasing cost industry, the cost of production will rise. That shouldn't be there. Sorry about that. In an increasing cost industry, the cost of production will rise as supply increases. In other words, think of it this way. As you have profits, so existing firms supply more, new firms enter. As new firms enter and the supply increases, that's going to put pressure on some of the inputs, on some of the resources, on some of the factors of production. So that increase in supply will work to drive up resource prices. Okay? In other words, rising resource costs will cause the individual firm's cost of production to increase as the industry supply increases. In other words, since as output expands, average total cost curves will shift upward because resources are more expensive, existing firms will need higher market prices in order to justify and rationalize producing more. And as a result of this, the long-run supply curve for an increasing cost industry will slope upward to the right. Okay, this is the case in most industries, and it's likely to occur in any industry where, for example, the important resources are constrained by nature. You know, any industry, construction, for example, where you need wood and iron and steel and cement. Construction is very heavily dependent on natural resources, and those resources are constrained. As construction expands, that puts more pressure on the supply and demand for sand, for concrete, for rocks, for concrete, for timber, for framing, for steel, for support, for glass, for windows, etc. So as construction expands, that's going to put more pressure on existing resources which are restricted by nature. And that's going to drive those resource prices up. which will drive up the cost of production for those firms, so their prices will have to rise, and the supply curve will slope upward right, okay? So you see this in industries that are really nature constrained, land constrained by their resource base. You also see it in what are known as extractive industries. Extractive industries, they extract from the land and nature supply. So industries like, agriculture and fishing, mining, lumbering, all of those industries that utilize large portions of the total supply of a specialized natural resource. You also see it in some cases like specialized labor markets. So think about the labor markets for professional athletes, the labor market for things like surgeons. By definition, in those specialized labor markets, as the industry expands, it's going to put upward pressure on that scarce labor resource, drive up costs, okay? So that's what that is. You can see right here, just for illustration, a couple. We see in panel A, a constant cost industry. Notice that, when you see an increase in demand at first, that's then going to lead to some profits, which will then increase supply, but the price will revert back, and you're going to see a perfectly horizontal curve. Again, you see an increase in demand. You're going to have an outcome in the short run with some higher prices and some profits, but then firms will enter, prices will fall back down, but they'll fall right back down to the exact P1. Notice here that the price at point A and the price at point C are the same. So it's going to revert back. On the other hand, here in panel B, we see an increasing cost industry. And here we can see that you're going to have your original price is here at point A. You're going to get some sort of increase in demand. Something happens that drives up market prices. This is going to bring new firms in. They're going to supply more to capture those profits. But that increased supply, you're going to see the outcome in the short run. As new firms enter, however, supply goes up, but because of the scarcity of some natural resources, you're going to settle right here at point C. This is the outcome after. Notice here that the price at point A, P1, is below the price at point C, P3. In other words, my friends, what this is telling you, let me erase this and clean it for you, is that the chain of events that went from stability to demand goes up to short run profits to more entry to the industry expands, this is going to raise the overall cost of production, and the ATC curves will rise, and as a result, the long run supply curve will slope upright. Okay, this is really the case in most industries. Finally, we do have a third potential result. This is known as a decreasing cost industry. In a decreasing cost industry, surprisingly, resource prices will actually decline. Resources actually get cheaper as the industry expands output. In other words, my friends, the entry of new firms into the industry will cause the ATC of existing firms to decline. Because of this, the long run market supply curve, okay, remember, not the short run supply curves are always upward sloping. But in a decreasing cost industry, the long run market supply curve will slope downward to the right. When might this happen? This can happen in some specialized industries like technology, where there's really big economy of scale regions. So if you have profits, which then leads to entry and the industry output expands, if we're in the economy of scale region, that expansion of output, that increase in scale could actually bring economies of scale and drive down some resource prices. And that could cause a declining cost industry. But my friends, these are rare, okay? So this was just a really quick technical jump into the long run supply curve in a competitive industry. We have one of three potential outcomes: constant cost industry, increasing cost industry, decreasing cost industry. That is why if you ever do further technical analysis, you might see long run supply curves that are horizontal or upward or downward. Thanks, my friends, and I'll see you in a bit for our next and final video for this segment. Thanks. Talk to you in a minute.